And like, what does formation for leadership, what does formation for participating in God's mission look like in light of all that?
I think I'm going to give people a 300-page checklist of all the right and wrong things to do, and then that'll be that. They'll just have to memorize it, and then they'll know the
That's worked
answers.
in the past, so I.
I don't know, man. I'm gonna throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah.
uh, I grew up in leadership, sort of formed in the ecumenical movement, and so that like global experience
Mhm.
that sort of adds to a new and maybe decolonizing cosmopolitanism. That there's it's an expression of me of being in intercultural ministry, is like being willing to be transformed by the other. And
Yeah.
when we push ourselves outside of our comfort zones to experience the life and faith and witness of other humans, and I use those, I mean, those are very Christian terms, but I'm using that in like a very broad
Yeah.
sense, that we can't help but be transformed by those experiences.
Mm, yeah. So, um, so you've had the chance to kind of travel around the country, also around Canada a lot over the last 3 years as moderator. Um, what are some of those, or maybe what's one of those encounters, or one of those moments uh, that has really sort of impacted you from, I mean, there's probably a lot to choose from. You've probably visited a lot of communities, a lot of churches, but also just like the broader community as well. And how do you, when you think about that time, and maybe it's too soon, but how do you think that experience has sort of like shaped or maybe even transformed how you understand the church or you understand the church in mission and that kind of thing?
I mean, I think in the United Church, we have a lot of diversity in our unitedness. And I think that we understand that philosophically, and we definitely understand it theologically, because there are some social and theological places where there's still pretty stark difference
Sure.
of opinion, difference of understanding across the church. But I got to see, because it was so like I was so all over the place all the time. So I never kind of really got comfortable in one spot. Got to see a lot of the cultural and sort of ecclesial difference. I got invited to be one of the preachers at the Crux of Fusion conference that happens among slightly more evangelical
Yeah.
uh, leadership in the United Church. And Gordon Smith was the keynote, and he kept asking us this question, like, is your pneumatology sufficient for the life, work, and witness to which you have been called?
Mhm.
Because I
What does that
think the
even
theme of
mean?
last I think his the theme of the conference was come Holy Spirit.
Right.
And so like pneumatology, of course, is like our theology of the spirit.
Mhm.
And so it was just like, is your connection to the Holy Spirit alive enough? Is it sufficient
Mhm.
to the life, work, and witness to which you have been called? And he knew he was talking to a bunch of pastors, but I think
Sure.
that kind of gets at some of the questions raised by Andy Root and Blair Bertrand in their book, When Church Stops Working, around the way that secularism has impacted the churches, not so much in the like kids having to choose between soccer practice or Sunday school, or their parents having to choose on
Yeah.
Sunday mornings, but the idea of this loss of a sense of the transcendent, right? That everything is imminent, and we believe in what we can see and touch and taste, and that we have lost a sense of the transcendence of God, and that the church is somewhat bereft because of that. And so I really, they say in their book When Church Stops Working, they have this example about where you can see it most starkly is when there's an act of gun violence in the US. And all the politicians start saying thoughts and prayers, um, and the response of like some social justice oriented organizations and congregations has been thoughts and prayers are not enough, because they're advocating rightly for, you know, gun reform,
Yeah,
gun ownership reform, and they're like, but like on the other hand, we're also saying that we don't actually believe that our thoughts and prayers are sufficient for God to intervene and to change people's hearts and to like allow that social change to take place. Right? That
absolutely.
we're literally testifying to the fact that we don't think that our prayers matter.
Yeah.
And what if they were what mattered most?
I mean, I mean, this is the world that we're living in, and like, so one of the things that I notice a lot of times when I go into congregations is that people really struggle to, maybe they have a reticence, maybe it's an inability to um, articulate their experiences of the divine. And I guess one of the things that I've been trying to figure out, like, and it's sort of in line with this, this imminent cultural frame that Charles Taylor talks about, that Andy and Blair pick up in their book. Um, but like, how do we help people to move beyond the imminent cultural frame? Like, are there practices that are helpful, or things that you've experienced, or things from your own experience or life that are helpful in terms of, reconnecting so that our pneumatology can be, all it is? Or are we stuck in this moment? This, I don't know if it's the Enlightenment. I don't know if it's just kind of like the world that we live in, where we're either unable or afraid to articulate our experiences of mystery, of the divine, of God in our lives.
Hmm. I mean, I think that in some ways, the church, when it's at its best, provides two very important factors for that, which is that we practice we practice our faith collectively, right? And so much of secularism and so much of life in the 21st century is, increasingly individualistic.
Yeah.
And so, even this idea that like I have to pray and center my day with meditation or whatever is like in some ways put a lot of pressure on the self to find the answers or to solve our problems. And I think, I've just been part of I was part of an Advent preaching series at St. Andrew's Presbyterian um, for this past Advent, or it's currently Advent now, but like when you guys are watching this, it'll be past Advent,
Yeah.
uh, on which was on the theme O Come Emmanuel, tied into the 1700th anniversary of the Nicene Creed.
Mhm.
And what does it mean to be a creedal people? And so like I think our creeds are a part of, the cynical part of us can say, oh, that's the lowest common denominator of like what people could agree to at a committee meeting. Um, but it is also a group that, our creeds come from groups of people or committees of people that come together to try to articulate collectively
Yeah.
like why this Jesus story that we follow as Christians matter, and in taking a pause from the busyness of life to actually spend some time attending to our spirits,
Mhm.
to share, to borrow a phrase from 12-step programs, to like share our experience, strength, and hope, and to care for each other when we're not able to see strength or hope in those experiences. And um, so I think the collective practice of our faith can actually help us to like make it's like built-in accountability for the practice of noticing like where is spirit in our lives, how do we experience the divine in the mundane, um, that's one piece. And I think the second is gratitude,
Hmm.
right? Like, um, we often talk about being blessed by God, but the late Ed Searcy, when he was minister at U Hill, used to always preach about how most times in the Bible that the writers, especially in the Hebrew scriptures, are talking about like it's our job to bless God, right? Like you are blessed because you are this transcendent um, force and spirit in the world, and that we really, our posture to the divine should be based in gratitude, and praising God
Yeah.
for the good that God self like makes available to us in the world. And it's a tough, like some people are really good at habits and some people are really good at like developing habits, and I am not. Like I actually just pulled this out of my desk. This is a little gratitude journal I started a couple, like I guess a year and a half ago,
Right.
and I did it from August 24th to September 3rd. And then September 4th, I started to write it down, and then like there was nothing underneath it, right? So
Yeah.
like it's it's hard to develop the sustained practice and habit of
Hmm.
gratitude, and even the way that like we fall out of practice from saying grace before a meal, and sometimes those things can feel rote and performative,
Yeah.
except for that they're there to remind us that actually that gratitude and grace is not rote or performative.
Hmm. Yeah. Requires this sort of deep intention and
Yeah, well again,
and
and
one
like
that can
what
be
if
reinforced or formed in a community or devalued in community or when communities are fractured.
Yeah, and I think in leadership, I was talking with a parliamentarian who used to be in ministry, and and we were talking about inspiration and worship, and I know that like even for ministry personnel, like public speaking is not always everybody's
Yeah.
superpower, and they were sharing an experience of finally getting a moment as a busy parliamentarian to go to church and
Yeah.
being so disappointed because I walked in and the clergy person, I don't remember which denomination it was, like put up their hands and was like, the Lord be with you. And it was just like so casual and flat,
Mm.
and they were just like, oh no, this is going to be terrible, right?
Yeah.
And the way that we read scripture sometimes, like forgetting that a lot of it's poetry,
Mhm.
or the way that we read a sermon, if we preach from full text, as if we're reading a document and not as if we're like daring to preach the word of God and to like inspire awe and faith and hope and healing and potential and caution and prophetic witness to the people who are, also like presuming to dare to hear the word of God,
Yeah.
as fallible as both those lenses are. And so, um, I think that we sort of get tied up in this idea of church is something that we do. It's a list of check boxes of things that we do,
Mhm.
and like not really marrying the head and the heart to like how can I make this experience one that I where I practice gratitude and awe for um, all of the beautiful abundance that God reveals to us in the world, where I allow myself to grieve for the brokenness of the world, and knowing that our scriptures hold the answer for how do we discern our way into like more balanced ways of living.
Yeah.
Um, and to do that with care and attention and um, humility
Mhm.
is really important.
Yeah. What what place or what place does the mission of God that, has this church? What place does it, could it, at its best hold in the world?
Mm. Well, first, I think there is always hope for the Jesus story.
Good
Maybe
answer.
not always hope for the church, but for the Jesus story, there is always hope for and in the Jesus story. Um, I think like maybe maybe the church or maybe our faith won't matter in the same way that it used to in Christendom.
Sure.
And maybe that's a good thing.
Hmm.
Um, Especially given the ways that like power was the power of the church was co-opted by the state and probably vice versa in really intertwined ways. Um, and I think, I raised up themes that came up in David Bosch's Transforming Mission, and then some of the South African responses to that book, because he wrote it from the context of South Africa in the late 80s, um, which is that we have to practice humble boldness and bold humility.
Hmm.
And so um, when we're proclaiming the word, like we still need to be humble about that so as not to continue to cause harm in the name of Jesus on behalf of the church,
Sure.
uh, but that we um, and that we have to be very bold in that humility. So there's sort of like two sides of the same coin, but I think it's like, we still have to proclaim the goodness of God, and we still have to proclaim the salvific efficacy of the Jesus story, but in a way that doesn't have attachment to the outcomes and maybe ways that it used to when we tied in Christianity with civility or, what it meant to be a good Christian or a good citizen.
Mhm.
Um, that we don't have attachment to the the numbers of like bums in seats in the or bums in pews in the church or converting souls for Christ, but instead on knowing that God has assured us through Scripture that where two or three are gathered, God hears our prayers, and um, like two women from the Jehovah's Witness came to my door a couple days ago, and it was freezing outside. It was like -8, and they're like, "We're not going to take." And I'm standing there in my pajamas and my slippers, and they're like, "We're not going to take much of your time. We don't want you to get cold. We're outside. We're cold." But we did want to, everybody is on their phones and on apps these days, and we wanted to share with you this video that you can just go to by going to this website, and maybe we could have a conversation about it. It doesn't have to be today. And I said, I'll need to stop you right there and just like share with you who I am, what I
Yeah.
just finished doing for the last 3 years. So I'm pretty rooted in my own faith tradition, and I will check out your website.
Yeah.
Um, because I also have respect for the fact that you are out here sharing your message. And it's the very least I can do is watch a 2-minute video when you've been like walking around in -10-degree weather all the time. So, um, and I did that with a sense of openness and curiosity and like a gratitude, even though my understanding of what it means to share my faith would look very different.
Mhm.
Um, and knowing that um, I had been invited into something that was meaningful to them.
Mhm.
And even though knowing that it is very unlikely at this point in my life that I would convert to that faith tradition,
Mhm.
um, that it was still an invitation to
Mhm.
listen and to find meaning in what they find meaning in. And I feel like um I wish that for us. Like I wish that um it's like in the mid 20th century when the World Council of Churches started talking about like, oh, Missio Dei, and like it's God's mission, it's not our mission. Like missionaries had done harmful things, and so we
Right.
wanted to like take back this idea of mission, but without the human fallibility and like systems of oppression that were attached to it. But in a way, because we didn't do the work of decolonizing at that time, we also kind of like gave ourselves a loophole where it's just like, well, it's not our mission, it's God's mission, and God's going to do what God's going to do. And then, like, because it's God's mission, not our mission, we're just going to go over here and keep like perpetuating the same systems of oppression. But in a
Right.
way where we're not using God as the justification for it. Um, and when we realized that that was harmful, I think, like one of the outcomes of my book, when I was writing it as a dissertation, was there were members of my committee who had pretty much given up on the idea of the Missio Dei, that like it wasn't useful to talk about God's mission at all for exactly that reason. But I made a compelling argument for why I think it's deeply important for us to rumble with that idea. And um and he was like, oh, you saved this idea for me, because I'd given up on it and thought it was useless.
Yeah.
um and I think if we can talk about the church's mission and God's mission, and the way that there's a Venn diagram between those two things,
Yeah.
um it can be helpful. But we have to do it in a way that is intercultural and respects um the diversity of experience that we have as individuals and as communities and as cultures,
Mhm.
and that we are the richer for it when we do things that way. um
So so how did you redeem that for this person? Like what was it specifically in terms of your engagement with Missio Dei, the mission of God that that gave new life to the possibility that it can be decolonial, decolonized, and maybe still has some value in terms of how we not just think about mission, but also embody mission as individuals, as a church, as the church.
yeah. Well, I think like I wrote my perspective on that from a particularly indigenous point of view, and looking at broad strokes, sort of the ways that indigenous worldviews are different from Euro-Western
Mhm.
Christian worldviews. And some important pieces are around how we see history, how we define truth, not buying into justified truth claims as like some logical thing that we can regress back to a certain point where you just know something is like unqualified in its truth.
Yeah.
And that's sort of like a useless mental exercise, when I could just say my truth is my truth and Andrew's truth is Andrew's truth, and those things may be different. And of course they're different because we're different people and we have different perspectives and we come from different cultures. And so we waste a lot of energy trying to like prove things that don't actually need to be proved. What's more helpful when we tell our histories and our stories is the ethical and pedagogical commitments we have. Like, why am I telling you this story? What matters about it? And what's the right action that it's calling you to? And um, I think when we approach Christian mission from that perspective, it can be more life giving. We didn't tend to have binary dualisms or like the Cartesian sort of mind body split of Western philosophy. And so um, I think also seeing Christian mission from a more holistic perspective is helps us to decolonize it a little bit. Um, but I think you could do the same thing from a Minjung Korean perspective, right? Around
Mhm.
what is uniquely Korean, in a view about Christian mission, what is uniquely Zambian or Zimbabwean. Like we each bring our own worldviews and cultures to this faith that we say is, potentially universal, but that's so often
Yeah.
there's so much like Euro Western, Euro Christian um, control over what is considered orthodox or uh, justified, is being consistent with tradition,
Yeah.
as if the church only developed coming out of the Roman tradition in the
Yeah.
fourth century, right?
Yeah.
Like, so I think like being willing to have, and this gets back to my earlier comment about adventure and
Mhm.
cosmopolitan, like a decolonial cosmopolitanism, and seeing like global solidarity in terms of struggles with communities have traditionally been made marginal in society and in global economics, is that like to sit down with leadership in the um, Organization of African Instituted Churches, for example, which are like indigenous churches where Christianity spread organically, like from the Middle East down into sub-Saharan Africa. Like those churches are not uh, the product of Western missionaries going and teaching a European form of Christianity.
Mhm.
The understanding the differences between the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox families, and how and why they're different, and what their divine liturgies can offer to us in Protestant land, about who we are and how we understand God. Like all of those things are um, a testament to this, godly play. There's the story of the great family, where
Mhm.
you say that now you're one, um, of a great family who are as many as the stars in the sky and grains of sand in the desert. And, God created us in this beautiful, crazy, diverse, like not logical, chaotic world.
Mhm.
And when we approach how we understand God and how we understand the church and how we understand mission from that perspective, um, has to be some hope in that.
Yeah. Yeah. But I
Like,
think,
do you remember that movie Contact that came out in the 90s with Jodie Foster,
yeah.
where she's asking her dad when she's a little kid, like, do you think there's life out there? And her dad's like, I don't know, but if there isn't, seems like an awful waste of space. Like,
Yeah. Um, yeah. I was just thinking about, I think it's at the beginning of Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, where she talks about like these settlers who have like uh, been here in North America for hundreds of years, and they still have one foot back in Europe.
mhm.
Like they're still half on the boat, and they haven't actually arrived yet. I think about that like in that context, but I also think about that in terms of like the church's nostalgia for maybe it's the 1960s. It's the 1960s often. And the 400 person Sunday school, and if we could just replicate whatever magic, which wasn't so much magic as an accident of or the plan of colonialism multiplied by a baby boom. But the glory of the 1960s. Um, but we have our feet, sort of half in this present moment and half in a world that is no longer accessible to us. And and I think one of the things that I'm constantly wondering, right, is like at what point or where are we seeing the church engaging in mission not rooted in the 1960s, not rooted in the British Isles because we don't live there. Um, and I have never lived there, but my people come from there.
Yeah.
Um, Like what is it to be a church in and of this place amongst the people who are here, as opposed to, I don't know, this terminal nostalgia that we have, some of us anyway, for a time and place that is not available, and maybe never even existed, right? Like it's just kind of like this. I remember the best things of, for me, it's not the 60s, right? Like I never saw the 60s, but I have some pretty fond memories of the early 2000s that I try and replicate wherever I go. And so, I'm not immune to this, but like I often wonder, like what does it look like to inhabit, to embody a church that's liberating for this time and place, that sees liberation as something that is for all of us and not just something that, like, because I mean, certainly having grown up in the evangelical church, right? Like that sense of mission was like, ah, is like those people in darkness over there, whoever they are. They might have been
Yeah.
Catholics or United Church people or people of no religion, right? Like we got to go save them, whoever they
Yeah.
are, the people who are not
Yeah.
us. But
Mhm.
like, what does it look like to embody that kind of liberating mission in this time and place that's not so can we ever not be consumed with nostalgia, I guess, and like maybe that's part of the liberation. I don't know. This isn't actually a question. This is just me kind of processing a few things kind of out loud around like, how do we move forward? How do we move forward together? How do we, we're never going to disentangle ourselves. We're never going to reach a pure state of like, and that, of um, this is what God's mission looks like in this time and place. But from where we are today, like how do we move forward together in embodying,
Mm.
you know, this hope and embodying this liberation in being not just for one another, but I think you talk about like mission with one another.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah.
Yeah, I think in the book I was trying to get away of this idea of like acting for others is kind of like a benevolent thing, which Tillich talks about in Love, Power, and Justice as being like the slippery slope into sin, where we like rob others of the their own inherent agency to act on their own behalf, and that like it's when we experience the compulsion to dominate, it's really easy to name that as sin, but when we're acting on behalf of another,
Yeah.
which is sometimes a very efficient way to live together in community,
Mhm.
we always have to be double checking, like, am I robbing somebody of their opportunity to practice their own agency? And if I'm not robbing them of the opportunity, am I at least being respectful of the fact and cognizant of the fact that um, the others on whose behalf I'm acting also have their own agency, and I am approaching whatever action I'm taking or decision I'm making with the utmost humility and respect for the trust that's been placed in me.
Yeah.
Um, and but like I also think you said something about like not being perfect and having a sense of nostalgia. Like I think that so much of that comes up from fear and like not knowing what to do next,
Mhm.
right? And I think the Western world, but humans in general, have a huge fear of failure as if it's bad,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
failure drives innovation, right? Like Thomas Edison was famous for saying, I haven't failed 10,000 times. I've just tried 10,000 ways that didn't work.
Yeah.
Right? Like yet.
Yeah.
And that's one side of things, is that like we need to fail in order to iterate um and to try new ways of being in the world. But the other is like we're so scared of failure. And I am a recovering perfectionist. I think one of my biggest accomplishments um during my time as moderator is I had this big dream to, on the one hand, have these big conversations about dreams of in the church, within the church, but to
Mhm.
use that same method to have conversations in Canadian society about like what is the future we want to create together, and create a more like secular church kind of conversation about we may have different means of achieving the same ends, but like what are the ends that we share that we're
Yeah.
working towards, and how can we have a conversation about that. And because the church is like mostly people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and sometimes 90s that are largely out of the workforce, we actually found out we didn't have the social connection anymore to like bridge that gap between church and the secular world in a way that was scalable. And like I spent some money on trying to do it. And then I also was like, okay, this isn't working. I'm not going to throw good money after bad. And after two failed events, try and still pull off another 11. Right?
Right.
Like, how fabulous. That didn't work. And people are like, oh my God, it didn't work. I'm like, yeah, it's fine. Like,
Yeah.
but I'm also not stupid. Like, I'm not going to keep doing it because that's what the plan was.
Yeah.
Like, it didn't work. What I learned was this is way easier to do when you have a big, uh, you have a big community of people who are at the prime of their work lives and have enough authority to say,
Mhm.
I know it's a little weird for us to think about having a conversation with the United Church of Canada, but hear me out.
Yeah.
Right? But like, we didn't have people with the social capital who could do that.
Mhm.
And so all of those invitations flopped.
Yeah.
And now I know why.
Mhm.
And so I'm not going to do that again. But like, it wasn't a waste of time. And if it had worked, it would have been amazing.
Yeah.
And I think we have to get better at letting go of our attachment to certainty and
Mhm.
risk management. Um, and because when we hold on to certainty and our aversion to risk too tightly anyway, is part of what makes us positional and do things that harm
Mhm.
people. Like
Right.
some of the ways that we do things can be interrogated, because I also think that the structure, like the the processes and procedures inside our churches come from the time of Christendom when the church was much bigger, and maybe they are not allowing us to be like nimble enough for a world that is very much changing. And so having some conversations about like how do you discern what is the next right thing, whether you're trying to plan for a redevelopment of your property or safely host an out of the cold meal, or you know setting up a commercial lease with a daycare and not getting robbed blind and being put at all kinds of risk because you think, oh, daycare, working with kids, that is a thing that the church should be aligned with, but not thinking about is it not a nonprofit daycare or is it a for-profit daycare? And if it's a for-profit daycare, like maybe you should charge them for-profit rents. Right?
Yeah.
Like, and have more than like a one-page lease that signs away the farm to the daycare that is in your basement.
Yeah.
Um,
That doesn't sound
you
like a real
know,
example at all.
no, that has never happened ever in the history of any church.
Where are you seeing signs of hope? Where are you seeing
Hmm.
new shoots? Where are you seeing interesting things being transformed, that you're paying attention to?
Hmm. Um, I mean, one of the beautiful things of getting to have the experience of serving the church as moderator over the last 3 years is I feel like there's so many examples of like new shoots of green grass coming up all over the church, from congregations that are growing in terms of the number of people that are attending when that was not a thing that they thought would ever happen to them again. Really creative community partnerships with like unlikely partners.
Mm.
um, I think um, finding our footing in an age where there are multiple conflicts, moving away from interfaith dialogue for interfaith dialogue's sake to like putting some ethical commitments behind things and moving to interfaith solidarity.
Mm,
as maybe being a more productive use of um, energy and time when there's so much to do. Um, because our commitments and our theologies will not always overlap in ways that are productive at different times in life. And so, like I think about the flooding in BC in 2021, and then again this year, or was it 2022, 2021, right? The
I can't
first flood, the
remember.
first flood in Abbotsford.
Recently, 21, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And the way that the Sikh community really just like, in part because in the Lower Mainland, they're so much a life force in our local logistics and transportation sectors, and also have access to a lot of wealth and intergenerational wealth. So like to see the Sikh community come forward and like be the immediate first responders and like trucking refrigerated trucks full of food to drop off points that were flood safe and where there wasn't like using families private helicopters to do food drops, and um responding in a way that historically the church might have, but no, they weren't the religious community that had the time and energy and money and connections to do that.
Yeah.
But like we didn't also like stand up as the church and be like, how can we help? Right, like you take the lead, but how can we help in this, because we also want to care for our neighbors. um so I think there are opportunities for more interfaith solidarity than we're used to. um and then I
What will
think the
that take?
number.
Like, what will that take? There's opportunities, but like, can we even do it?
It will take becoming friends with people who are different than you, because like like I'm serious, if you become friends with people, it's
Yeah.
so much easier,
Yeah.
right? Like, I had a conversation with Karen Hamilton, the former general secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches, right after October 7th, and just said, like, she was part of the Parliament of World Religions. She's like very well known interfaith uh, representative from the United Church and from the Canadian Council of Churches, in interfaith dialogue. And I was just like, what do we do? And she was like, honestly, like everybody's so traumatized right now.
Hmm.
Um, there's not a lot you can do. Like interfaith work happens one coffee at a time. And when there's a crisis is not the time to reach out to interfaith leaders you have no relationship with,
Hmm.
right? You have to work at building relationships with the other faith leaders in your community every day, all day. I mean, aside from writing your sermons and planning your liturgy and running your out of the cold meal or whatever, but like on a regular basis, have that touch point so then that you know each other. And I think this is Bonhoeffer, and you go back to Bonhoeffer, everything leads back to Bonhoeffer. Um, this is his point in life together, right? Is that we have to know our neighbors so intimately that their prayers become our prayers.
Hmm.
And so if you don't know your neighbors, then it becomes hard to stand up for them, whether it's for them or with them, right?
Hmm.
Like it becomes difficult to do that because we're either paralyzed by fear, or we're out of touch, or we're at risk of causing more harm.
Yeah.
And so, I think reaching out to the communities around us and getting to know our neighbors in a new and intimate way is really important, for the church's own health and well-being, but for our communities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I often sort of joke about this, but I say often in churchland that I have more spiritual and like deeply searching conversations with people who don't go to church than with people who do. And
Yeah.
that's like on the walk to school, with my kids and with other parents. I don't have to walk to school with my kids anymore. They're 12 and 9. but I
Yeah.
do it because of the conversations that come and that sense of like, yeah, coming to know other people. And sometimes it's pretty surface and sometimes it's deep and searching and like, but that wouldn't happen if every morning there wasn't a walking school bus of neighbors who just happened to walk together to
Mm.
school and wait until the bell rang. Not that our kids even say goodbye to us anymore, but we just kind of hang out. And it's become that thing, but that's how you do it, right? It's
Yeah.
it's that coffee, it's that walk, it's that time to be together and to build those relationships over time
Right.
that isn't dependent on people coming into my space to do whatever it is that I prescribe for them, but for us to just like, you know, be open to encounter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
You got it.
Okay.
There's the answer. That's the answer we were looking for.
Yeah. Only took us an hour. But Carmen, thank you so much for this time and for your deep wisdom and your bold witness to what God's up to in the world and in your own life too. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the invitation.